Hello everyone. So this is Crawling Horror, Creeping Tales of the Insect Weird, edited by Daisy Butcher and Janet Leaf. It's obviously part of the British Library Tales of the Weird. Really nice, obviously really nice edition, collection, series. This is really an anthology of entomological fiction. It sort of traces the history, the chronology of entomological fiction from sort of Gothic tales of the early 1800s to the 1930s, sort of scientific era, or the sort of the weird tales era as well. Um, and I think I can say that although I enjoyed most of these stories, I think because British Library Tales of the Weird deals mostly with underrated authors, and especially the fact that a lot of the stories are from the early days, obviously the sort of antiquated 1800s. Although I definitely I used to read that that sort of era prolifically. I think that they could have done with a bit more contemporary feel to them. I think they get a little bit samey after a while, especially the first couple of stories. It's just the language as well. Maybe it's because I'm finally reading a bit more contemporary, quite a lot more contemporary fiction. It just doesn't do as much for me anymore. I just can't really feel as much. But a lot of these stories are sort of decent reads in and of themselves. But it's just my sort of preference seems to be shifting a little bit. So really, the first story is one by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm not going to go too much into each story. It took me actually a surprising while to read this. I think I was just sort of fatigued a little bit from reading all this sort of complex, weird fiction. The first story, The Sphinx, is really about, although it's an Edgar Allan Poe story, it's quite sort of, it's just a short, it's only a couple of pages, and it deals really with the idea of distorted perception. And there's some Egyptian elements as well, really, I think. Which is actually, so the next two stories are also Egyptian as well, so I felt like there could have been a little bit more variation there. Anyway, The Sphinx, I didn't particularly enjoy too much of it. So the main gripe I had with The Sphinx is that it's just a long conversation ending with a sort of revelation, and I'll give you just a little quick hint. I don't want to go too much into this because I'm aware that I read excerpts from every single review and I talk about every single story. I'm not going to do that for this one. However, it's just something this is actually my second take. Something I've should have mentioned earlier is that there's actually, I hope you stick around in this review, because there's actually a story in here. It's about in the middle section of it that's really caught me off guard. It's actually, not only is it one of my favourite short stories this year, it may actually be one of my favourite short stories just in general, and that might sound quite weird to say, but I was really sort of captured by it, and I'll go into why that is, and I highly recommend you read this short story that I'll cover later on. But back to The Sphinx, the first story by Edgar Allan Poe. I'll give an example of some dialogue, or not some dialogue, but just an inner monologue, first person. I remember his insisting very especially, among other things, upon the idea that a principal source of error in all human investigations lay in the liability of the understanding to underrate or to overvalue the importance of an object through mere measurement of its propinquity. To estimate properly, for example, he said, the influence to be exercised on mankind at large by the thorough diffusion of democracy, the distance of the epoch at which such diffusion may possibly be accomplished should not fail to form an item in the estimate. Can you tell me one writer on the subject of government who has ever thought this particular branch of the subject worthy of discussion at all? Yeah, not particularly gripping first story, to be honest. In my earlier days, I might have said that was profound, or it sounds intelligent, so it must be good. But I just think that it's just sort of rubbish, really, for a first story. But anyway, let's go on to the better stories. The Blue Beetle, A Confession, it's a good one though. Definitely. Just going from that to the Blue Beetle, A Confession by A.G. Gray June. So this story was an interesting one for me, really. It seems to be the person who wrote this definitely was a fan of Frankenstein. It's almost exactly like Frankenstein, and even uses some of the same imagery and language. It's interesting. This really is about a man who creates a blue beetle, and he comes to regret this decision. and I was really quite captured by it. Uh, I think just the way becomes obsessed by it, and it sort of haunts him, and just the way that this is a fluorescent blue beetle. It's quite ghostly and ethereal. Yeah, that's all I really want to say about that one. And there's also this imagery of dyes and blue spots arranged on sort of marble white skin. It's really quite a good one. The Mummy's Soul. We're still in the 1800s. This is from 1862. The last story, I should say, was 1857. The Mummy's Soul, an Egyptian one. This one was okay. It was surprisingly dark. It actually starts off where the other two are fairly domestic. This one starts off in a crypt, and it's really quite evocative and quite dark. And so there's some really quite creepy imagery here. The insect of choice in this story, and I think actually I just realised I think I'm not going to talk about each of the insects, just so it, if you do read this, and I do recommend the book, if you do read it, then that'll just unfold naturally for you. The insect here, it's the beating of its wings produces quite ethereal, weird music. It's quite an interesting one. Again, this is another gothic type tale. It's all about obsession and madness, definitely. Slow wasting away of characters, and there's some quite surprising imagery here. The character is actually taken on a sort of visual or sort of visionary journey into Egypt at various times. And for example, once again, as in bygone days, I wandered among the majestic ruins of Karnak. Masses of rock carved into graceful shapes stopped my way. It goes on later to say, for example, it says, as I listen, the magnificent temple dissolves in the soft twilight, and a sublime idea of Sesostris shadows my soul like a cloud. The majestic agony of silence. I was lost in the forest of columns of the Grand Hall at Karnak, and shivered with the supernatural terror beside the granite statues at the entrance of the temple of El Uxorin. I hungered and thirsted in my journeys among these shreds of ancient grandeur, and my soul asked for relief, for terror itself had become colossal. So this is very much romantic, gothic type style of story. Really quite good. The next story is another Egyptian one. I'm just going to briefly just cover this. This is a 1868 story. After 3,000 years, it's another. It's about it's about a necklace in connection with an insect. And it's just that sort of standard sort of romantic 1800s tale. It didn't really do much to me for me to be honest. So it's Scaraby. Yes, I think I'll skip over that one. It's a decent story enough. One of the things now that I would like to say is that the fact that although this is from Insect Tales of the Weird, Creeping Tales of the Insect Weird, I found that most of these stories don't particularly feel weird. They're gothic and horrific, but they don't feel weird. However, A Dream of Wild Bees definitely does, from 1895 by Olive Schreiner. This is quite a short story about a woman who is visited by bees in her garden, or as she said, a window, I believe. And this definitely feels like a weird story, as in the genre weird. I'll just read a little section to you. So I believe this story really is about it's a mother who she's either wanting a child or she's had a miscarriage. It's weirdly evocative. It's about these sort of ethereal, again, bee messengers who visit this mother or mother to be, and they seem to be like promise certain things, and they talk to her in quite a formal, angelic way. So for example, let me touch the child, said one, for I am love. If I touch him, he shall not walk through life alone. In the greatest dark, when he puts out his hand, he shall find another hand by it. When the world is against him, another shall say, you and I, and the child trembled. Child inside. Let me touch, for I am talent. I can do all things that have been done before. I touch the soldier, the statesman, the thinker, and the politician who succeed, and the writer who is never before his time and never behind it. If I touch the child, he shall not weep for failure. And there's a strange part where this seemingly, this gaunt creature appears, and she asks, "Who are you?" And it seems to negate everything that the bee messengers have. An interesting one. It seems to be quite open to interpretation. The next story I very much enjoyed. 1895, The Moth by H.G. Wells. I really enjoyed this one. It's a humorous tale about entomological rivalry. There's something about this. It's very, the writing is very confident, and it's this idea that these two scientists are fighting among each other, trying to one up with various papers and whatnot, scientific papers in their journals about obscure matters, and something happens to one of them, and there's a kind of a haunting where it's suggested that the insect has basically come back in the form, or sort of reincarnated in the form of this, I should say that the person who's died, I'll say it has come back into the form of the insect, and then that causes havoc for the other person who's still alive, essentially. Really fun, really enjoyable. The way it's written is very confident. It feels quite accurate to the sort of scientific obsessions and rigour, and just the idea that we always need to get a paper published or disprove, it's like your pet theory or whatever. So now I was debating whether or not to cover this at the end or just as it appears. Now, this is the story that I was talking about. This is The Captivity of the Professor by A. Lincoln Green. That's a pseudonym, actually. We're not quite sure who he is, so it's very interesting. It's quite enigmatic. The Captivity of the Professor, one of the longest stories in the collection, but I actually, every time I think of the story now, I actually smile. There's something about it that is just magical, and I was speaking to a friend about this, and really I can say that it's about a professor who goes to the Amazonian rainforest, sort of the Andean region, and he meets with these white ants with pink faces and blue antennae, and they seem to be hyper, super intelligent. And it might sound a little bit campy, or it might not sound that original nowadays. There's something about this that is so magical and fantastical, and there's something about the writing where it feels like it's almost modern in a way. 1901 not being that far away or that far back, but I kept smiling at the story, the way it's written. For example, there's a part near the start, so just at the very beginning, there's a part I'll read to you where the professor who's gone on this expedition, who's gone up the river, and I'll read this bit to you here. At length I reached a spot of such extravagant beauty that I rested on my paddle, almost wondering whether I had wandered into dreamland. I was in a clear circular pool at the foot of a magnificent waterfall, and shut in all around by dense tropical forest. In front of me, festoons of splendid orchids hung from the lacework of creepers which lined both sides of the cascade, while to and fro between them glittering bunches of hummingbirds of inconceivable brilliancy of hue darted in front of the white veil of falling water, so that it seemed as if some ambushed genii, spirits, among the flowers on either bank were pelting one another with handfuls of blazing rubies, emeralds, amethysts, opals, and diamonds. The central conceit of the story is that, I will say, I'm so enthusiastic about the story, I'll possibly give some spoilers, but this story, it's all about this professor who is taken captive by these ants, who seem to command other species in the rainforest, such as armadillos, such as jaguars, such as monkeys, and they really seem to, and snakes as well, and they really have complete dominion over the rainforest, it seems. And there's such charm to this story, where I'll say, I'm just reminding myself of parts where he actually holds, at the very beginning, he holds one of these insects, one of these ants, in his hands, and it looks up to him and it sort of nods its head like a human, and it's got this pink face, it's sort of, obviously the blood vessels in the face, this sort of pinkish reddish face, and it seems to regard him with wise eyes, and there's something There's just something incredible about it. And from there, I could not help but connect with this character in this sort of situation where he's taken captive by these ants and he's put in a little hut. And there's a very, I was saying to a friend, there's a very almost world building feel to it, where every detail is planned out. We'll have spiders on the hut that'll drop down. If he tries to get out, the ants will hop back and forth, so the ant will actually ride a hummingbird, or they're called cavalier ants, these white ants with the red heads and the blue antennae. The cavalier ants will ride longicorn beetles, almost like cavaliers, and they'll chase him, or they'll sting his neck or whatever. And he eventually he comes to sort of, it's almost like a Planet of the Apes situation, where he comes to sort of almost regard the cavaliers as he actually wants their respect in a way. And it's really funny and humorous and endearing. It's just I want to go into a lot more than that. And I think the only thing that I'll say is that the only other thing is really surprisingly psychological. We'll have this part where he gets so frustrated about a situation where he will yell at the top of his voice all of his accolades, his scientific accolades, and it feels real. It feels like it could be a genuine situation, even though it's quite magical and fantastical. It almost feels like the Jungle Book in a way, like something Kipling would have done maybe. And the ending is quite endearing as well, so I'll leave it there. I highly recommend reading The Captivity of the Professor. There are a couple of Japanese stories. The Dream of Akinosuke and I forget the other name, Butterflies. I didn't particularly respond to these. They're fairly, I guess they're just it's almost like Japanese folklore. It's not really my sort of thing. It's very beautiful and very sort of regal and royal, but I just didn't. They're quite short. They're more like vignettes really. I'd heard a lot about E.F. Benson before. I think he actually has his own edition of in the British Library Tales of the Weird. So I was looking forward to this, this next story, but I didn't particularly respond to it that much. It's called Caterpillars. It's really, it's about this man who stays in a hotel in I think it's Italy, and he encounters sort of monstrous caterpillars that have strange properties. You can see there's I guess I can say there's a broad range of, we get ants, we get beetles, we get mosquitoes, and we get caterpillars and whatnot. Decent story. An Egyptian Hornet, however, by Algernon Blackwood. Now Algernon Blackwood is living up to his name, because this story is quite an interesting one. It's and there's just this idea that this proud of himself, this overly pompous religious man, he's going to his congregation in, I believe it's in Egypt. Is it in Egypt? It might be another Egypt story, but that's not particularly important for this story. He's walking to the bathroom and he encounters a huge Egyptian hornet actually, and he seems to struggle with it a lot. He's this holy man. He's a holier than thou type person, and he struggles with it. And then there's this sort of rustic salt of the earth character who comes in and just flicks it out the window basically. And there's quite a good idea that this evil sort of commoner or whatever, just religious protagonist can just he's fearless and he's superior to him, and that is shown in a very straightforward way, in that he's not afraid of the Egyptian hornet. I quite enjoyed that sort of theme. I'm just to save on time, I'm going to skip the blue cockroach and the wicked flea. The blue cockroach I didn't. It seemed to just sort of pass me by. I'm not entirely sure what it was about, to be honest. Anyway, the wicked flea. We're into 1900s, by the way, the sort of early 1900s. The wicked flea. I did not enjoy the story whatsoever. It seems to be quite a campy story about a gigantic flea, and it's supposed to be humorous, but I did not enjoy it at all. And there's a police character who has this sort of, the dialect is very difficult to get your head around, and it's just seems to be quite a common character who doesn't sort of speak proper English, and it's just, I did not find it enjoyable or humorous, or I just sort of skimmed most of it, to be honest. I don't usually do that with. The next story, The Miracle of the Lily, is actually surprisingly good. It feels almost modern in a way, and again, a lot of these stories do have. It's a dystopian story, where again it has that world building feel to it. It's almost epistolary as well, and we get this sense over thousands upon thousands of years of these descendants who are they're faced with a crisis. These overlarge and prolific and profuse insects have basically ridden. Basically, the humans have got no food left, and we learn how the generations deal with this. What I find really quite enjoyable about the story is that we get this line, this chronology of these people who are writing about the predecessors' times and how they've dealt with situations, and we'll get people like Thanor, and before him Delphair, and it's really about this. What reminded me most about the story is the film Wall-E. Actually, it's definitely, I think they might have actually taken some inspiration from this. It's almost like Wall-E plus Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, if you've seen that film. It definitely feels like that, actually. They use spaceships and they've got sort of gas masks, and they've got sort of oxygen plants. It's quite, it feels like this could be made into a film. It's quite modern and it's quite enjoyable. The next story, Warning Wings, from 1929, and I realise I've not been giving the authors, but this one's by Arlton Eddy. This is a fairly short one. It's the thing about this collection. The editors themselves say that they wanted to give a sort of broad spectrum, so everything from monstrous insects to ethereal messengers, and this is an ethereal messenger type story, where this moth saves some people, and I won't actually say more than that. It's quite a warming story, a heartwarming story. Second last story, the Beyond the Star Curtain. We're really getting into the scientific fiction now, by Garth Bentley. This one is also one, I think it might be actually the longest story in the collection. This is I thought this might have felt a little bit campy, but it's not. It's about these two. It's about an Englishman and an American who they're in the far future, and they're actually able to actually fly outside the universe itself. And I thought that was quite daring for a story from the 1930s. I'm not, as you probably tell by now, I'm not particularly interested in sci-fi. But I thought that for a 1930s story, that was quite interesting to actually not just go to a different planet, but actually to go beyond the star curtain and actually enter another universe where there are these blue planets, and time doesn't seem to exist. And these two people, they live among the Karakuans, I believe they're called, and that's actually only where that's kind of like exposition. The story really begins when they come back to Earth and find it completely changed. And really, I can't say much more than this, other than that it's a sort of enjoyable heroic adventure. Really, it's really quite detailed and quite impressive. They use this ovoid ship to fly across this sort of swampy, primeval, almost carboniferous landscape, where it seems that it's actually the far future, and it seems that humans have been overtaken by insects. And so, again, there's quite a few stories that are like that, but this one's quite unique. The last story, 1938, which I actually read today, is Leiningen, or I believe that's how you pronounce it, versus the Ants. Not too much to say about the story. I found it decent. It's about a heroic character who lives in, he's a sort of a farmer in Brazil, I believe it is. Maybe not Brazil, I think it's somewhere in the sort of Amazon region, where he is sort of inundated by a great horde or swarm of ants. It's another ant story. And it's almost like a sort of, I think he tried to, I got the impression that the author tried to emulate the Battle of Troy, or some or maybe just some sort of medieval siege, in the sense where the farm is a farm that the setting the story takes place in, and the sort of a concentric ring of ditches that are used to guard against this attack of the ants. but also there's mentions of Dante as well, and I also imagined that it might have been sort of like the circles of hell as well. There's also literally rings of fire at one point, so it's quite interesting. So that was Crawling Horror. I'm not sure what I'm going to review next. I've got a couple of fantasy stories to review, possibly Blood in the Mist, things like that. So again, another review. Thanks for watching. Cheers.